Regulated.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
This podcast focuses on regulatory and corporate developments in highly regulated spaces. I'm Christian Bax, and I used to regulate medical marijuana.
I'm Tony Glover, and I used to regulate alcoholic beverages, casino gaming, and tobacco. Now together, we're regulated.
Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of Regulated, very special episode where we have a special guest from the Miami Herald, Miss Samantha Gross. How are you doing today?
Doing good. Thanks, Christian.
So Samantha is a politics and policy reporter at the Miami Herald. Before she moved to the Sunshine State, she covered breaking news at the Boston Globe and the Dallas Morning News. She has a degree in journalism from Boston University, but she's here today because it's hard to kind of find good information sources in cannabis media. And in Florida, in my opinion, there are about 4 or 5 reporters who are really kind of focused, who I personally go to for news because I think they demonstrate they have a lot of insight. They've been doing it for a little while. And most importantly, when I read their stuff, I learn something new. Samantha Gross is one of those reporters and was one of the choices that Tony and I wanted to do to bring in to talk about cannabis in Florida. And it was the perfect situation because she actually wrote like an omnibus review at the end of December about all the stuff that had happened in 2019. And so I wanted to have her in and talk about what we learned from 2019, what we can expect in 2020. So just right off the bat, Sam, how did you get into writing about marijuana and the industry in general?
Yeah, so when I first started at the Herald, it was September 2018. I was assigned to cover the midterm elections, and I was specifically assigned to cover Nikki Fried's race for agriculture commissioner. And so in doing that, I had to learn a lot about cannabis because that was a big part of her platform. You know, she had a lot of ideas on, expanding access, and she talked a lot about her days lobbying kind of in the space. And so I had to learn pretty quick about the cannabis industry in Florida. So ever since then, I kind of became the go-to cannabis reporter for the Herald. We don't have anyone covering it, as a dedicated beat. And ever since then, I've just kind of cultivated the beat, talked to a lot of people, and have really ingrained myself in the community, talking to patients and doctors and businesses and folks who work in the legislature on these issues.
So you got kind of just tossed into it.
Essentially, yeah.
Did you? I mean, if I'd asked you like 4 years ago that you would be one of the more widely read cannabis journalists in Florida, what would you have said?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So I went to college in Massachusetts, and during the time that I was in college, they were making a lot of progress on their cannabis control commission, and I was following like politics in Boston. But yeah, I don't think I ever would have thought I would be reporting on it. I like politics, but I didn't know cannabis would become part of that beat too.
When you were writing your piece that summarized what happened in 2019, what the more eventful things that occurred in the industry, was there anything that stuck out to you in particular as kind of a visceral moment that you remembered from that year, no matter how big or you small, and that just still sticks and you think about it, like that was actually super important and struck you at the time?
Yeah, certainly. I think that the one moment that really resonates with me is being sent to Winter Park, near Orlando, to cover this press conference that, the new governor, Ron DeSantis, had said it was going to be a major announcement. And my editor was like, you better go, because I had heard from some sources that it was going to be about cannabis maybe. And we had no idea what was going to happen. And when I got to that press conference, the governor had asked the legislature to change the law and to allow smoking medical cannabis, and basically challenged them and, said if they don't change this law by mid-March, he's going to drop the state's appeal of a court decision that says banning smokable marijuana violates the constitutional amendment that legalized medical marijuana in the state. And in that moment, it was kind of like, the governor had been making a lot of big announcements. The Clemency Board had taken up the Groveland 4 case. Like, there were all these different things that he was kind of rolling out, and he had just been sworn in. And so I think that moment was really big, seeing him flanked by, Congressman Matt Gaetz and Lieutenant Governor Nunez.
And John Morgan.
And John Morgan, of course, in his backyard at Winter Park. I think that was a really big moment. People realized that there was going to be major change in 2019. That was kind of a big one for me.
It's funny because I didn't tell Sam that I was going to ask that question, and I've written down in my notes that's literally the exact same moment that I thought of. Like we pulled it up on the Florida channel, and it was on like this projection screen in the office, and it was really interesting to watch. The first thing that struck me, I think that struck everybody, is that Matt Gaetz has one of the most incredible hairlines of any of any men in the public eye. It's like literally the lowest hairline. It's perfect. And the second thing that struck me is that John Morgan was suing the state at the time. He had coined the phrase "no smoke is a joke." He had just eviscerated the state for the last year on Twitter. And to see those three people in particular up at a microphone was just, it was such an interesting, unusual moment, having, been the director for 3 years, to see those three particular people all up there. And at the time, there was one very important group of people that weren't in front of that camera, and that was the sitting Florida legislature. And did you at the time, like, what was your sense about the legislature's feeling about that press conference, kind of getting publicly called out by Governor DeSantis, being flanked by John Morgan?
I think, it was interesting to hear the committees kind of have to react really fast. And, it was my first time covering the legislative session in Florida. And I think in that moment, I understood the difference between the chambers and the way that they approach things, because the Senate acted really fast. And I think they voted on a bill to allow smokable medical marijuana like the third day of session, and the House took a little bit longer. And I think like seeing how they reacted helped me learn about how the chambers operate. And, Senator Jeff Brandes, who sponsored the legislation in the Senate, I had talked to him about this issue prior to the governor's announcement, and the governor was using words that the senator had used. And I wrote a story about this, about how this one senator who has kind of this passion for this thing definitely had the ear of the governor. And you heard DeSantis talk about, he used the word cartel to describe the vertically integrated market and things like that. So I definitely thought it was interesting to see the Senate act really fast, and the House, came after.
When Governor DeSantis had that press conference, it was about a different issue, but he used the phrase "a sword of Damocles hanging over somebody's head," and it was a very real sword of Damocles in that situation, because the legislature was essentially checkmated. They couldn't defy the governor because he could just unilaterally dismiss the lawsuit.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, he said, "Here, man, here's a good faith effort. You can go ahead and change the law, or I'm just going to change it for you."
Yeah.
So, I mean, they have, like, specifically the House has some very, very specific opinions about cannabis, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I was always just curious about how the House would respond to just basically being confronted like that so publicly.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, in the committees where they had to start taking these things up, there was a lot of discussion about making the bill a research bill, that there is not much science behind why smoking medical marijuana is useful. They were bringing in people to speak in front of these committees that doubted a lot of that. And it was interesting. And I think this is something that was really, talked about a lot in 2019, was specifically Representative Ray Rodriguez's opposition to the whole idea, and to trying to, limit the amount of THC that could be, smoked using smokable medical marijuana and things like that. And eventually, the House and Senate came to some sort of agreement, and what was passed, I think, was really close to what the governor had wanted. And yeah, I don't know. I think it was just interesting hearing the debate in the House versus the Senate. And there were definitely senators that were kind of calling for the same things, more research, dubious of why it's necessary. But with the new governor, I think a lot of people had different mindsets, and they felt that they can, support something that Governor DeSantis was behind too.
Were you surprised at all in your coverage of that, of how quickly that bill got out and got sent to the governor? I think it was the first bill of that session that actually got signed, that got passed by both the House and the Senate, sent to the governor.
Mm-hmm. Kind of. I mean, the governor had sent a deadline of mid-March, and I believe the bill was passed March 18th. Um, so, I mean, I think that people were kind of waiting. What surprised me a lot was because it was such a newsworthy thing and everyone was watching this piece of legislation, the fact that it got signed into law quietly. I think Governor DeSantis was on a golf trip and it got signed, and we saw that it had been engrossed was interesting. That was surprising to me, but I think the timeline followed pretty much what I had expected, especially seeing the strong push in the upper chamber in the Senate.
And you had mentioned that the governor used the C word about the cannabis industry, and that
Yeah,
was it was you can actually, when you watch that video, I went back and watched that again before we recorded, and it wasn't much, but Matt Gaetz, his face doesn't change, but you can see John Morgan, like, kind of his eyes got a little wide. He kind of looks at DeSantis like, yeah, I can't believe he just said that about the Florida marijuana industry. But notably, the administration walked that comment back. So I don't think, like, there was subsequent reporting where that position was kind of clarified, but at the time, using that phrase about that industry, it was a pretty compelling moment, I think.
yeah, certainly. I just think it showed that the governor had been having conversations about this with people who were really passionate about the issue. But yeah, the administration did walk it back, and there hasn't been any movement on the Florida grown case, which I think we'll talk about later. But it was something that, the governor had challenged and said, these are things I want to take action on. We haven't seen much action on the vertical integration side of things right now, but when he did say that word, I think it caught a lot of people's attention. And I know that afterwards, when people were taking questions from the press, that was something that was brought up, by most reporters who were asking him questions, and to clarify what he meant by that.
It was a less reported on, but I think equally important signaling of how far things had come, which is, if you saw how quickly from when that law was engrossed to when the MMTCs were actually selling flower, from a regulatory perspective, the turnaround that from the Department of Health was like lightning fast, right? And the fact that, at the time, Director Coppola and DOH were able to turn that, it sent a very clear signal that the leadership from the executive branch of the government also wanted that to happen, and that DOH, to Director Coppola's, at the time, Director Coppola's credit, to be able to turn that around so quickly, I think it very clearly showed that everyone on that side of the fence was on the same page as the need to get this done fairly quickly.
Yeah, certainly.
It's been interesting to watch the dynamics of the actual market, because now you have some of the larger scaled MMTCs in Florida. It's half of their business now is
Hmm.
raw flower for, smokable product. And, there's one in particular that's all they do now, is basically they just sell flower. Have you seen any change in the perception from the marketplace, from, like, patients about the market as a whole, since that change has happened?
Yeah, well, I talk to a lot of patients who actually have issues getting flower. A lot of people seek flower for what cannabis experts call the entourage effect, or the effect of smoking mostly like unprocessed marijuana bud, whole flower cannabis,
Hmm.
with all of its like natural compounds intact. And because it's become really popular, I actually did a story about some of the bigger companies in Florida having these flower shortages. And so I think that's been like the biggest impact I've seen on the market since smokable went online, is that a lot of people want it. A lot of doctors recommend it to patients, but it can take like 10 months from the time a company wants to expand its operation into growing flower until when the product can hit the shelves, just because of the actual growing of the plants, and building a facility to grow it can take like 6 months. And I think the kind of rush to get more product on the shelves, get more whole flower to patients, has put some sort of strain on the industry. I think people are catching up, but that's been the biggest effect I've seen.
So speaking of access and dispensary points, one of the biggest things that happened, that developed over 2019, was that we added 8 more MMTCs. So with each at the time had 30 to 35 dispensaries that they can open. That number has since increased since we added patients. But you wrote some stories about some people who are particularly interested in acquiring those licenses. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? There was one guy, a couple guys in particular that are kind of in the news these days at a national level. But I thought that whole story and that whole situation was really interesting.
Yes, the cannabis industry in Florida is a lucrative one. And when these licenses opened up, there were a lot of different types of people looking to acquire one. And two particular people that I wrote about with my colleague, David Smiley, who covers national politics, was Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman, who are these two South Florida businessmen who were charged with illegally funneling foreign money into U.S. politics. They are associates of Donald Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, and they sought cannabis licenses in Florida, our sources have told us. So
that was basically confirmed, right? There's a
yeah.
lot of sources that verify that those two guys were talking to lobbyists and lawyers and business people, specifically in Tallahassee, but up around Florida, about trying to snag one of those one-pointer licenses.
Oh, yeah. It's pretty well reported. We were the first people to write that story. I mean, I had called pretty much every marijuana attorney or lobbyist that I knew would be like well connected in that way, who had said that, you know, these people, they were seeking this license, but they weren't able to show capital to, you know, behind what they were, you know, pitching. So yeah, it's really interesting. And actually, recently, former Congressman Carlos Curbelo had tweeted that Lev Parnas had come to meet with him about cannabis in Florida, which was interesting to me. But yeah, as recently as May, they, you know, these two men, Parnas and Freeman, were talking to attorneys about, you know, seeking a license in Florida, but our sources have told us that their plan was unsuccessful because they just couldn't prove they had any cash to sustain the business.
I want to talk to you a little bit about those conversations, because it initially surprised me, but now it's just kind of par for the course that every lobbyist and almost every administrative lawyer in Tallahassee has a cannabis client.
Right. Yeah.
Have you been surprised with how ubiquitous that the industry has been and kind of the legal and the lobby players in Florida?
I don't know. I think that these players kind of are drawn to these industries that are, you know, really lucrative and competitive. I think that because the cannabis program has been around for a couple years now, that people have kind of gotten an understanding of how hard it is to break into the business and how much you need to invest in a good lobbyist and good attorneys to even get to that point. And I also think that there's been enough time to kind of understand how lucrative the existing businesses are and what the potential, you know, for more business there is in Florida, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. I've also, you know, met a lot of lobbyists and attorneys who are taking on clients that are interested in industrial hemp, which is a new program that's kind of budding in the state. I mean, there hasn't been any licenses issued yet, but I think people are really bracing for that. And so I don't think it's surprising that there are a lot of people interested, but it is interesting, especially, you know, some of the folks who you would think maybe 5 or 6 years ago, you could never imagine them touching, you know, the cannabis industry.
And I'm glad you brought up that issue, because there is a lot of action now with lobbyists and lawyers in Florida with industrial hemp, right? And it's a big entrepreneurial hotspot. What are your feelings on the development of this hemp and CBD and this gray market that's exploded in Florida over the last year?
I'm going to start with industrial hemp because it's interesting. When the bill passed to create this state hemp program, I talked to a lot of farmers and people from out of state who were interested in coming to Florida to seek these licenses. But a lot of experienced hemp growers in states like Colorado were telling me that people need to slow down in Florida because you can grow hemp all you want and it grows really fast and it grows in all seasons and it has all these great qualities that people talk about all the time. But you also need to build these fairly expensive processing facilities to actually do anything with all of that. And so that's been a dynamic I've been following, and I think it's interesting. And people who are interested in growing here, I do wonder what that will look like if there's going to be so much raw material that has to be sent to other states for processing, or if Florida will be able to keep up with processing the, raw plant, but that's, left to be seen. But that's my little rant on industrial hemp, just from folks outside of the state.
Do you get the sense, I mean, has that shifted at all? Do you get the sense that there's more emphasis being put on erecting those types of processing facilities to be able to handle that bandwidth? Or do you think we're still just kind of running head forward into a really bad bottleneck problem?
I don't know if it will become a really bad bottleneck problem just because the licenses haven't been awarded yet. And so it's still unclear how many people are going to try to be breaking into this industry at the same time. But I do think that it's something that people will be thinking about, and that folks who do build these processing facilities and that work in the processing side could see interest in coming to Florida and capitalizing on that.
Moving from industrial hemp into some of the consumer packaged goods stuff, some of the stuff that we've seen in CVS and Whole Foods, what has been your feeling on the development on that side of the industry?
Well, I think my eyes were opened to this side of the industry when I went to the CBD Expo in Miami Beach this year, or last year in 2019. And I have never seen so many different products, CBD bath bombs and energy drinks and CBD joints, and I mean, everything you could think of. And this was well before any rules had come out. And I had been asking people, you're selling this in Florida. These products are coming from other places. What of that? And how do you make it?
How are you doing this?
How are you doing this? And the answer to that is, pretty simple. Like there isn't a lot of oversight over selling these kind of gray area products. I mean, we have a hemp program now, but we don't, the rules for CBD edible products just came out. And it's really interesting to see, a lot of these stores selling all of these things. And now that CBD rules have come out, I think what I'm going to be trying to keep a close eye on this year is how many businesses are getting these, permits from the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, which is going to be doing the inspections of kitchens and things like that for edible CBD products. And I know they've already gotten started, and it's a big state, and there's a lot of these products being sold. And I don't know if they'll ever get off the shelves, these things that are untested. But the commissioner, Nikki Fried, when she first started in office, had a press conference about this, and she was saying, I see these things, some of them you don't really know what's in them, and if they don't have a fresh from Florida seal, like I don't trust it, and I wouldn't recommend you people to trust it. And I don't know, I'm a skeptic, I'm a journalist, and so walking around like that expo was just a really good example of like, how are all these people selling all these things? But they are all over the country. So
have you noticed any kind of overlap between the groups and the entrepreneurs that you talk to, your sources, who I call the industry, just the industry at large? Are people trying to wait for these coming medical marijuana treatment center licenses similar to the same groups who are looking to really take advantage of the new hemp program, or do you see them as two discrete groups of people?
I see them as two different groups of people. I've never talked to anyone who has an interest or any stake in both. The people who are interested in the medical marijuana licenses generally seem to come from a business background. They're looking to come and capitalize on a really lucrative industry here. Some of these people already have been involved in other publicly traded companies. And I don't know, I think those people seem to be like more of the investors and the big business kind of experts. The people that I talk to on the hemp side have come from like more of an agriculture background or like a processing background, if that makes sense. So those are the types of people who have a better understanding of what it takes to grow the plant and cultivate it and make sure that it falls at a certain THC level that is legal within whatever state they're working in. And they just seem like different types of people. I mean, maybe there is crossover and I haven't found it yet, but they definitely seem different. And I think that kind of goes for the people who are in the state now who are interested too. The people who want to invest and break into the medical marijuana industry are very different.
Before I did any work with cannabis or really started educating myself on it, I learned and have some practical experience in commercial agriculture for just corn and soy. So like large scale commercial agriculture, and kind of familiar with how the margins and how that business works. And one of the things that concerns me, and I'd love to get your thoughts on how this applies to kind of hemp, is there are 50 50 states in the US whose departments of agriculture or their regulators are getting ready to kind of turn this faucet on for hemp. And so you're going to have this commercially produced agricultural crop that's going to be hitting all of these states at the same time. And it seems like that much supply, that much activity happening at the same time is, if you don't have a buyer with, a committed contract in the future, it seems like a pretty good equation to lose a lot of money if you're not prepared for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the larger scale issue of what we talked about earlier with hemp farmers not having processing facilities in place. When you take it nationwide, obviously that's something that the country's going to have to brace for. But I think like any new industry that's kind of up and coming, there will be like an acclimation period and things will level off. And this isn't the first time that hemp has been. This isn't the first time the country has dealt with the product. It's been a while, but I think that like any other industry, there will be, a kind of fluctuation period of trying to adjust on, how much supply is needed for the demand and what kind of processing facilities need to be in place. But I don't know, it's hard to predict. I'm not a hemp expert or a farmer, so.
What's the most, so when you were walking around that conference and just generally in your reporting, what's the most interesting product or concept that you've come across?
Oh man, I've seen a lot of things. A lot of beauty products I think are interesting. There were like full salons set up where you could get your hair done, your makeup done, a facial, a foot massage, like all pedicure, hemp exfoliants. So I think that was really interesting to see like maybe someday in the future there will be businesses where every single product they use is hemp and like that's, the gimmick. I saw a lot of like animal feed and bedding in like huge bags. And I think that is a thing that a lot of people in the agriculture industry are taking a look at because it is like a really sustainable way to create a lot of bedding for horses and things like that. I saw like bath bombs that smelled really good and a lot of like candies and gummies. And one thing I actually learned at this conference was I had no idea how big of an industry the white label CBD gummy industry or any really CBD product was. There were so many white label products that I've seen them on shelves, at different stores. And you're like, that looks really similar to this product. And it's like, oh, well, it's the same. So that was kind of eye-opening, these big companies that mass produce gummies and candies and things like that. I saw some CBD like energy drinks and a lot of infused like food. They had stands with sandwiches that had CBD like dressing and hummus. It's interesting. Yeah. At Art Basel this year, there was a lot of like that kind of thing, like CBD foods and alcohol.
The ones that get me are the ones that it's just not clear how CBD could help in any way. So, for example, I've seen like CBD toothpaste and CBD mouthwash, right? So it's like you're not even really consuming that. You're just rubbing it on your gums, or in mouthwash, you're just swirling and it's mixed with alcohol and you spit it out. So like, so it's funny because it had to have been like 3 or 4 years ago, just back when this was still not a thing, nearly as much of a thing. I was talking to staff in the house, and this was kind of some of their first conversation about how you could basically infuse cannabis or CBD into almost anything. And I used the analogy as like, basically, how when you have a toddler and they walk around the house and they like put anything that they can touch in their mouth. Think about the exact same way, except the cannabis industry is like, if you can put it in your body, or like it's a consumer product that you can use on your body somehow, you can turn that into a CBD product. And you should expect at least one person is going to try to turn that into a CBD product and sell it at a pharmacy or on Amazon. Okay, that's kind of the state of play for those are some of the stories that I thought were really interesting. And now we're in the present, so we're going through a legislative session. Was there anything in particular that's come up, or any bills that you think are particularly interesting?
I think there are a lot of bills that are really interesting and that would definitely change the state of play, but I don't see any movement on any of those bills. And so I'm monitoring them and I'm watching to see if they'll ever get a hearing, but none of the bills that I'm following have been heard. And some of them don't have sponsors in both chambers, which is a bad sign for a bill. So I'm definitely keeping an eye on them. I think there's some interesting ones, things that were brought up even last year that have made their way into their own bills, like waiving fees for veterans seeking medical marijuana cards. That came up last year as an amendment that didn't pass. There's a bill adding sickle cell disease to the list of qualifying conditions for a medical marijuana card. That one hasn't been heard in either chamber. So I think there are some definitely interesting ideas and some lawmakers who have filed these bills, but haven't seen much movement.
There's one really interesting bill that Thurston put forward, which would essentially create like a franchise model for people could open dispensaries, but your dispensary could contract with one and only one MMTC, and you basically act as like a company store for that MMTC. And then, Sabatini had his bill to basically change the and to the or and basically deconstruct vertical integration with a fairly elegant change. And then, you had the big one that had a lot of press coverage, which was Brandis and
Yes.
Smith filing respective bills in their respective chambers to just straight up legalize adult use recreational marijuana.
Yeah, those ones got a lot of attention. Something I wrote about it. It came about the same week that one of the ballot initiatives that was seeking to legalize recreational use had kind of stepped back and said, we're not going to be on the ballot in 2020. And so a lot of people looked at those bills and they were like, that's the answer.
Right.
But neither of those bills have been heard. Senator Jeff Brandis has it in the Senate, and Representative Carlos Guillermo Smith, who's a Orlando Democrat, has it in the House.
So you mentioned the specifically Make It Legal Florida, which had, when you're following this, right, why do you think that specifically Make It Legal Florida and Regulated Florida just didn't get enough traction in order to get on the ballot this year?
Well, I think that both of them face different issues. The Regulate Florida had started collecting signatures a lot earlier, and initially they had a lot of signatures, but they weren't getting a lot of money to fund the effort. And Make It Legal Florida, which started a little bit later, was having a hard time getting signatures at first, but they were, getting a ton of funding from the industry, from specifically Parallel, which operates as Certera, and MedMen. And so I think there were interesting dynamics, and they did different things. The Regulate petition notably would have allowed for home grow, and the Make It Legal Florida one did not. Make It Legal Florida kind of grandfathered in existing license holders to sell recreational if it were to pass. The other one did not. So I think that the issue that both Regulate Florida and Make It Legal Florida faced goes back to a bill that was tacked onto a tax cut bill at the end of the 2019 legislative session that essentially changes the way that ballot initiatives can get a question onto the ballot. And so what this bill does is it, among other things, requires ballot initiatives to pay petitioners by wage or hour, not by signatures gathered, which makes it, a more expensive process because you're not paying for the product you're getting, the signatures, you're paying an hourly wage for these workers. And it also requires that the gatherers, people who are getting these petitions, register with the Secretary of State, and that the petitions are turned in within 30 days of them being signed. And so it sounds kind of simple, but it didn't include any funding for the Secretary of State's office. And so what happened was the Secretary of State's website for registering these petitioners was crashing all the time, was like down for days at a time, had major technical issues. And so it slowed down a lot of these ballot initiatives who were also losing a lot of money paying these petitioners hourly to get the signatures that they needed. And so with a law change, with not a lot of time to do it, I think they had to have them in by February. They have to have them in 30 days of being signed. So like by basically January 1st was the deadline, and they just ran out of time, is what it seems like, and money.
Obviously, the game doesn't stop, right?
Right.
So I would eat my laptop if the recreational bill from Smith and Brandis passes the session, right? I don't think that's going to happen. And I think that obviously Regulate Florida, Make It Legal Florida have both stepped back.
Right.
Who do you think is in the pole position moving forward for kind of the path to 2022? Like which of those groups, whether it's the legislative movement or Regulate Florida with their kind of core group and minority, or Parallel and MedMen and the Make It Legal Florida. Who do you think is the most likely group to actually get something in a position to advance forward?
Well, I don't think it's going to be the legislature. I think that if the legislature wanted to do it this year, they could do it this year. And I think that the fact that these bills aren't being heard, I just don't have a lot of faith that the legislature would act on this unless they were, being directed by the governor or something like that. I think that, like you mentioned, both the petition.
And I 100% agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, that's just my speculation, and anything could happen. But I do think that these petitions can gather signatures. The signatures stay valid, so they can keep doing it for the 2022 ballot. And I think that the Make It Legal Florida they're both very different, but I think just the fact that they have a lot more backing and funding will get them further. But who knows? And this year Regulate was the one that had pulled ahead, and then the Make It Legal Florida one jumped in the race, and we weren't expecting that. And maybe someone else will have a petition, or maybe one of the other license holders will get behind one. I mean, it's left to be seen. I think anything could happen in this industry. It changes very fast.
We talked earlier about visceral moments that really stick with you, that you remember. And for me, it was kind of a small moment, but it was something that really affected the way that I saw the constitutional referendum race between Regulate Florida and Make It Legal Florida at the time. It was back in 2018. I had just left the department, and I was down at, I think it was Can Lab's third conference, and I was speaking on a panel. And then I got down, and the next panel came up, and it was this group of guys who were basically finance guys. And so it was investment guys, VC guys that, who monitor investment guys and VC guys, and like write blogs about marijuana financing, which is also very interesting. But they got done with their spiel. It was like a 40-minute spiel, and then they opened it up for questions. And I don't remember the woman's name. I didn't independently verify that this woman is who she said she was. So I'm just saying what she said. So she gets up during the question and answer session. She goes, "I'm so-and-so. I'm with Regulate Florida. And you all are talking about this potential windfall from Florida legalizing adult use, AKA recreational marijuana. Would any of you here today commit to helping to fund Regulate Florida?" And it was crickets. And she goes, "Well, we don't have any money, and we need money in order to make happen what you guys are talking about is this windfall in the future, making all of this money. So again, will any of you commit to helping us achieve this goal?" Again, crickets. And so she's like, "How should we fund Regulate Florida to get a recreational marijuana passed if people like you, who have the most interest in potentially making money off this, won't give us money now?" They were literally, it was the most Marie Antoinette answer I'd ever heard. It was like, "Well, you guys should throw a fundraiser." And she was like, "Well, thanks, guys." So I walked out of there, and man, this was not this wasn't like an arrogant thing. This wasn't some bat from the crowd standing up screaming down these guys who were like capitalist pigs trying to make money on marijuana. This is a very reasonable woman who was like, there's a chain of events that have to happen, and you guys are talking about this explosion of wealth. You have to light that fire and like guide that match, that spark, down the little string before you get to the stick of the dynamite. We're having a problem with the string, and you guys need to help us. And just the way they blew that woman off, it told me a lot of things. One, it was Regulate Florida. According to that woman, Regulate Florida was having problems with funding in 2018. And the second thing was like, the cavalry wasn't going to come to help them if that was any indication of what people with money in the state were thinking.
Wow, that's a crazy story. I think that's really telling too of the industry. I've gone to a lot of like networking events and stuff in the cannabis space with a lot of investors who say they're waiting for adult use, but I never even asked the question of, well, who's going to fund it? Yeah.
How much money have you given?
It's a good
Yeah.
question on her part, but
Well, and that's the thing, is you mentioned earlier about the number of lobbyists and lawyers who in specifically Tallahassee, because Tallahassee, for as small as it is a regulatory hub. It is a choke point. It is something that like you need representation in Tallahassee if you want to be part of $100 million business. It's professional malpractice not to have someone with the the beat of the pulse of the legislature and the administrative agencies that regulate you. But all that said, you have to insert yourself into the process in order to make proactive change, right? And that costs money. Referendums cost money. The reason why 70% of Floridians voted for United for Care's Amendment 2 was because John Morgan bankrolled it with millions of dollars, right? That just didn't happen because of organic grassroots
Mm-hmm.
activity. And so that's really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for, like, if you can get the same kind of grassroots momentum along with a handful of people that will actually put several $1 million into this, I think that's the formula for it gets heard. Because I think if it actually gets on the ballot, especially in 2022, when we'll probably have 600,000 patients in the state, at least, I think it's got a really good chance to pass.
Yeah, I think so. But I also do say, it's not a presidential election year. And I think 2020 was a really big goal for a lot of these groups that want to legalize adult use cannabis, but also other groups who want to get other sorts of things on the ballot that are having also, a hard time financially achieving that. And it'll be interesting to see if people show up to vote in 2022 if this were to make it onto the ballot. But, it's not a huge election year. And so I think that's left to be seen too.
It's a good point. It's a good point. And what strikes me, so my first political job ever was, like, I was an intern on the Repeal the Bullet Train initiative, like way back when Moses wore short pants, right? When we had this amendment that required people to build this bullet train across the state. And then there was a second referendum to get that off. But that was also the era where there was all of this kerfluffle about having language in the Constitution that regulated, like, the size of commercial pig pens. And there was kind of this reaction, like people's reaction to seeing something on the ballot was, do we really need this in the Constitution? And unless it was especially compelling, the answer is usually no. But it seems like everything has flipped. So even in the last cycle, 12 of the 13 amendments that were on the ballot passed. So it seems like if it's polling particularly well and it's a well-written ballot language, that the sea has shifted a little bit, and it seems like Floridians want to pass things up on the ballot unless you give them a reason not to. Like if it's a tax issue, they don't seem to like that very much.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. I think the fact that something ends up on the ballot means people want it, whether it's polling well, but you also have to have, 766,000 signatures from, different congressional districts across the state. And I think that is also telling. I mean, it's a pretty high bar to get onto the ballot. Yeah, we'll see.
I'll go ahead and put out there, I don't think anything that opens 381-986 passes this session. I think that the shadow of Flora Grown just looms too large over this whole session. What do you think about that?
I agree. I think that people are kind of holding their breath. The Flora Grown case will disrupt every part of this industry in some way. I think it's going to touch a lot of people when the decision comes down. And I agree. I think that people are holding their breath, but I don't know if the shadow of Flora Grown is the reason nothing's going to happen. I think it's also just people kind of backing away from the issue a little bit this year because it's not a directive from the governor. It's just mostly, the Democrats that have less power in the legislature pushing these bills, aside from Senator Brandes and Sabatini.
Do you get the sense that the small group of people in the legislature that have been charged with carrying this very heavy weight on their shoulders for the last 5 years are getting burnt out at all? Like, are getting kind of tired of, because it's this drumbeat every year. It's very contentious. It's, there's a lot of money at stake. Do you get the sense that they're taking a breath this session, just like, I just don't want to deal with it?
I don't know if that's it. Maybe. I mean, last year.
Is that a mischaracterization?
I don't know. I mean, I haven't talked to that many lawmakers about it just because it hasn't been that big of an issue this year. No one's really talking about this legislation. It's been filed, but people talked about, the adult use bills, certainly, but the other ones, not really. And I don't know if it's that they're burnt out from doing it. I just think that last year they had to act really fast, and it was under direct order from a brand new governor. And so there wasn't really a choice. People wanted to do it, and it got done. But this year there isn't really that pressure. I think, some of these bills, like I said, they're being pushed by people who don't have a lot of power and whose bills don't necessarily always get heard. I mean, there's exceptions to that, obviously, but I do think there isn't as much of a focus on cannabis this year because there's not the governors pointing a finger and saying do this by the state. So I
Yeah.
don't know, and I do think that people are waiting to see Florida grown. I think once the Florida grown case comes down, I'm sure that there will be legislation that kind of comes after that, maybe in next legislative session, to deal with some of the repercussions, whichever way it goes. But who knows?
Oh yes. I think if Florida. So I mean, and let's just take a step back for a second because we our show's been growing fairly quickly, and so like we have people who we've been doing a little bit more of a national thing, and so like for people who aren't familiar what Flora Grown is, and if you live in Florida and been living under a rock, Flora Grown is essentially a case that's been going on for 2 years, and it challenges the essential structure of Florida's medical marijuana license and regulatory scheme as unconstitutional. And so in Florida, we have a completely vertical structure. So you have 22 businesses, and each of those businesses have to grow, process, and sell their own medical marijuana. And so if Florigon wins, basically you shatter that model. So you no longer have required vertical integration, and you also no longer have necessarily a cap on the number of licenses. And so you could go from 22 vertical companies to many, many more. What people have basically said the opposite: vertical is horizontal, even though that's not completely accurate. But you have what they call a horizontal market, right? What is your sense of the people who aren't necessarily of the MMTCs, like what the industry at large? So like people who are going to these conferences who want to get in, like what are they saying? Like, what are they thinking about this Flora Grown case?
Well, I think people are really anxious to see what happens. People, like you said, in the state have been following this for like 2 years, and I think people are interested to see. I do think that there are people who are like wondering if it will change the value of the licenses if this entire industry is disrupted, because that changes the dynamic of the types of people that are seeking them out.
And can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, well, with this is like kind of basic economics, but with a limited supply and a really high demand, you're going to have a really high value product. And right now, a license is worth so much money. I know you were kind of talking about how much a license is worth in Florida. It's not something I keep as close tabs on because I'm not on the business side of things. But I do think that if this industry were to be totally opened up, there are a lot of opportunities for other people to get involved business wise. People who are experts in processing or experts in marketing and can kind of get into these different pieces that right now have to all fall under one company. But I do think there are people who are watching it and thinking, well, if this gets totally broken open and opened up, what's going to happen to the value of these companies that they may be invested in or want to invest in? So I think there's both sides. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. But I also think people who are more involved on the access side are hoping that, more licenses, more opportunities to get into the business means more access for people who want to do business in this state and don't have a ton of capital, or patients who can have more opportunities to get care.
Do you have any predictions or things that you're looking for in the future, that things that you're closely following and are particularly interested in?
So I am focused on politics and policy and legislation, and because the
Hmm.
legislation surrounding cannabis isn't really moving, I think that is a story on its own that I'm following. Is if the state really does care to take up these issues or not, and it kind of is leaning toward the latter. I'm trying to think of other things I'm following. I mean, it's really just those two, and obviously like rulemaking that's going to come with the hemp program.
One of the things that I think 2020 is going to be interesting in, especially if the legislature doesn't do anything this
Hmm.
session, obviously Flora Grown is going to be fascinating regardless of how it works out. But 2020 seems to be the year that DOH is going to flesh out a lot of their rules for cannabis. And that's a couple big things, right? So that's laboratory testing and shifting from having the labs that are basically partnered with these MMTCs to being this whole independent, completely autonomous licensing structure. And then from there, once that's established, you've got two other really interesting rules for that specifically relate to products. So one is the hydrocarbon, and so any products that use hydrocarbons to extract and create. And the second is edibles, which is going to, Florida has not hockey sticked. So if you look at the amount of patient growth in Florida since the inception of the program, it's been fairly linear. There's been somewhat of a curve, an upward curve, but it really hasn't accelerated to what you see on some graphs where it's just like this elbow, this like 90-degree turn of an explosion of growth. I think edibles would do that. I think that would really accelerate things a lot. And so if and when that happens this year with that rule and then the edibles production, like if you look at the chart of the MMTCs that are producing in the state, if you look at those top 4 or 5, all of those guys are ready to go with edibles. So that will be super interesting to see their kind of creativity and their the money that they're going to put behind that in order to and how the patients in the state will respond as far as patient adoption and going out and getting their card and getting in the program.
And I think like the lab rules are really interesting, and I've been reading them, but I think our readers get like there's like a certain level of cannabis reporting that is like for the normal reader and then for like the cannabis wonk. And so I try to, toe that line. But
speaking of the wonks, right? I want to let you plug your newsletter. So you guys are creating a wonk, something for the wonks with the Herald.
Yes, the Herald loves the wonks and everyone. These are all really accessible stories, but we have started a cannabis newsletter. It's called In the Weeds, and it's hosted by me. I write a little intro every week, but it mainly curates all of our marijuana stories from that week and some old stories, some archived stories. And it comes out at 4:20 on Thursdays, and you can find it at miamiherald.com. And if you go to the newsletters tab, you could sign up. And it's really fun.
We will link that when we tweet this out. We'll link it in the show notes when we post it up on iTunes and Stitcher. So what's kind of the genesis of the newsletter? Like why did you and the Herald decide that was something that you guys wanted to do?
Yeah, so we had been talking about this for a really long time. I've been wanting a newsletter forever. One of my really good friends, I'm going to plug her newsletter, Felicia Gans of the Boston Globe, curates their daily RIP newsletter, which is fantastic. And I just love the idea of having all of these stories in one place. The kind of genesis of the newsletter was because a lot of my stories were being archived under the healthcare section, but because medical marijuana isn't the only story in the state right now, we found it really necessary to create a marijuana section of the Herald. And so now all the stories are being archived under marijuana, so it covers everything from CBD rules to hemp, medical marijuana, legislation, politics around marijuana, and some national news too. And so they can all live on one place and people can find them easier. Advertisers can find them easier. And the newsletter is a good way to curate all of that, those good stories that kind of have fallen through the cracks a little bit, in my opinion. They're really popular stories. Every time I write about cannabis, it's usually one of my higher performing stories of the week. So we thought, why not capitalize on that audience and give them, all these stories in one place?
And can you talk about that? Because I'm actually really interested in from the metrics. Right? I have no idea. Like how do you fundamentally track them? How are the stories? What are the metrics you use to track the engagement for each story that you guys put out?
Yeah, so we keep a really close eye on our metrics. We track what stories, how many people are looking at a story at any given time, how long they look at that story, which is important, and how many stories are LTCs, or led to conversion. So led to people to hit, what, I like this story, I'm going to subscribe to the Miami Herald. And so those are really valuable stories. On a day-to-day, I'm generally looking at how many people are on a story of mine at any given time, or how many page views, there are at any given time. And it depends. Like some stories do really well. We just did a story about at Green Spoon and Martyr, which is a Florida, mainly cannabis firm now, dropping ties with Parnas and Fruitman, which we talked about earlier. And that story had, a couple thousand eyes on it pretty much all day, the day that it had posted. But yeah, it kind of like fluctuates. I like to watch them, but generally, I write about healthcare right now, covering the legislature, and healthcare stories do okay. And then I write about cannabis, and it's double the readers. And it just depends on what it is.
walk me through like the baseline. So what I know you don't have the
I
statistics
know I
necessarily in
can
front of
get
you, but
them.
like just a generic baseline story, like approximately what kind of numbers you're looking at. And then like we don't have to say just like a run of the mill routine, but a particularly interesting story. So for example, like your year end recap of cannabis stories that kind of was summarized that you published back at the end of December. Like how does the generic story perform compared to your more high profile cannabis stories?
Okay. Yeah. So I just put my last stories for the last 40 days of traffic. And the wrap up story that you were talking about, 2019 was a big year for cannabis. This is what happened. There were 20,000 page views on that story, and 4 people subscribed to the Herald, through that story. And I'm looking at all my top stories from the last 40 days or the last like month or so. And it was that story, the one where the Make Legal Florida ballot proposal fizzled, the law firm that represented Partisan Freeman by quite a few. So it's really interesting to like look at the metrics. I haven't really looked at it that way. It's interesting to look at what people like to read. And I also think, our readers aren't reading some of the trade publications necessarily. So my stories might be the
Right.
only places that they read about cannabis news.
So Tony and I talk a lot about other regulated industries, right? So we talk about gaming, we talk about alcohol beverage, we talked about some other weirder stuff. But like the Boston Globe doesn't have, an alcoholic beverage section of the newspaper, right? They don't have like a gaming section of the newspaper. But more and more of these periodicals, these news entities are creating like a specific cannabis hub because as you mentioned, it's this weird combination of consumer products and healthcare and regulated industry and also a little bit of a sin beat feel to
Mm-hmm.
it. And it's all kind of in this one unique silo, but it seems like it has to be a driver of audience in order for these news sites to so many of them to
Absolutely.
have this separate silo.
Absolutely. And I do think because it's new, people are out in their communities and they see dispensaries opening and they see these things in the stores, like CBD products. And I think they're just curious. And I don't think people have the same feeling with alcohol and beverage or gaming because those industries have been around for a really long time. So I think that like the novel aspect of this industry that's still budding, no pun intended, and growing and changing is good.
I have one more newsy kind of
Okay.
thing to add because like I have this same problem. I'm like, other than this podcast, I don't create media, right? I don't write newspaper articles, but I write like memos, right? And I have to like describe what's happening in Florida. And it's so hard sometimes to describe a growing industry without using the word growing or blossoming or like hazy or something. Like do you have to like do you just lean into it? Do you just let the puns come or do you try to fight the puns when you're writing about cannabis?
I used to like really lean into the puns because I thought it was creative. And when I was first covering Nikki Fried's campaign, like they used a lot of puns and like campaign stuff, and so it was kind of like reverberating. But I mean, I really try to stay away from that stuff now, and I think like especially writing about really serious topics, it is hard to not use the word grow or like this legislation's up in smoke or like stuff like that.
Yeah.
We really try hard to keep it straightforward, especially these are things that affect real people and patients. A lot of the things I write about, so I try to stay away from the puns, especially if it's serious. If it's like something funny, like I think I wrote about when Jimmy Buffett came out with his own strain, like that had to be punny because it was a funny, lighthearted story. But yeah, I try to stay away from the puns as much as possible. I leave them for the tweets.
Have you noticed any trends or just from a macro perspective, interesting tones or ideas or thoughts that have moved through the industry over the last year? And I'll give you an example of what I mean. I try to go to as many conferences as I can, and what I notice is a lot of conferences sometimes have this sense of groupthink where like there's a message that the whole industry feeds each other over the course of the year. So, a few years ago it was the year of the MSO. These little mom and pops were now making good and taking on all these investors. And then it was the promise of becoming a public company. And the tone I really sensed this year was almost like a sadness, almost like a pessimism, because the market has been down now for almost a year, or I guess more than the market has been down for a while. And so a lot of these acquisitions, if you were acquired, the stock that bought you is worth much less than it was when they bought you. And these guys who want to keep growing, their stock's not worth enough to go buy people. So it's almost a sadness of and a anxiety to kind of get back to the roar that was happening 2 years ago. What are your thoughts? Like, do you have any kind of feeling from the industry that you've got any tones or themes that you're looking for in 2020?
Yeah, well, on that note, I think that pessimism is real. I try to go to as many conferences as I can also. And while I do hear that pessimism, I do see a lot of investors still showing up to these things and still having a lot of interest in Florida business just because this state is big and because the program here is growing. And not all of the businesses that are in the space here are publicly traded, and I don't think that the value of the stock, whether it's on the Canadian Securities Exchange or anything like that, is affecting every business here. So I don't know what the overwhelming another feeling would be in this industry this year, but yeah, I mean, I think that with any new industry, like I had said a couple times, on this podcast, things are growing and changing, and the markets have to adjust. And yeah, I mean, I think that especially like with new federal rules changing, that could affect the way that companies in America see the space.
I want to make a hot take, like a
Yeah,
prediction,
go for
right?
it.
So I think the rest of 2020 is going to be a similar, maybe not a pessimism, but like a malaise, because you had a lot of people who were writing in 2018 and 2019 about this almost imminent feeling that the federal government was going to legalize cannabis. And I don't see any significant action on that happening in the run up to a presidential election. And so even if a different party wins in 2020, they don't get inaugurated until January. So I don't think anything happens with 2020. So I think the malaise continues. 2021, I think, is going to be super interesting from a couple perspectives. One, I think that some type, it's just one of these years is going to be the years that the federal government does something. But the second thing I'm seeing more and more, I'm getting more and more phone calls about, is international trade, specifically with hemp, but more and more when you see like the EU countries in the EU starting to get medical marijuana programs. The EU is going to be where a lot of this international trade starts happening, because if you have two member nations and you have GMP, you're going to be able to cross borders there, almost like you can states in the US for interstate commerce. And that's going to be really exciting. And I think we'll see a renewed optimism when these growing MSOs now start to get flying to like Paris and Munich and start getting to talk about some international trade deals.
Yeah, that's a good prediction. I haven't thought that big, but I think that's really interesting. I agree. I think, it'll be interesting to see what movement there is on that front.
Samantha Gross, I want to thank you for taking over an hour to talk about Florida cannabis on this humble podcast. We very much appreciate it. And Samantha, can you tell everybody how they can get in touch with you, what your Twitter feed is, what your email of choice is,
Yeah.
if you want to reach out?
For sure. Well, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Samantha J. Gross. And if you have tips or ideas, or you just want to get in touch with me, my email is sgross@miamiherald.com.
Cool. Well, like I said, definitely follow Samantha on Twitter. She has a very good feed of information. It's something I will have to say that, like, in the morning sometimes when I'm in between things and I can pull up Twitter and I see like, oh crap, I have to make a phone call from Sam's feed. So that's been very helpful, and it's been great. I hope to have you on again in the future when things are moving again in Florida and there's a little bit more meat on the bone to talk about. We're not just kind of speculating about what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So with that, thank you again for listening this week. And since Tony is not here, Tony, if you're listening, then go ahead and use your tagline. Ladies and gentlemen, please stay compliant.